Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stay at Home. This is a political education series by Jacobin magazine. My name is Kale. I'm the video producer here at Jacobin. And every week for the past few months, we've been hosting a left-wing thinker, writer, or organizer to talk about something we feel is relevant or important politically for the left. So all of our previous videos are archived on our YouTube page, which is especially relevant right now because next week we're actually going to take a little summer break. So the website will still be publishing articles, but we most likely won't be putting out any new videos next week. So be sure to check out the dozens and dozens of conversations we've already been having. And our only ask right now is that you please hit like, subscribe, and share the stream with your friends. That's how we get these videos out to more people. So tonight's show is going to be a little bit different than usual. Instead of a lecture, we'll actually be doing something that falls somewhere between an interview and a conversation. We're joined by Walter Benn Michaels, who is a professor of English at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He's the author of a number of really wonderful books, including Our America and The Shape of the Signifier. But for our sake tonight, it's worth highlighting The Trouble with Diversity, which is now came out about 14 years ago, and it seems to only become more relevant with every passing year. In addition to Walter, we're also joined by Jen Pan. She's a staff writer at The New Republic, and you should check out all of her great articles, but I just want to highlight this piece that came out earlier in the year called Why Diversity Training Isn't Enough. It's where she offers us a critique of Robin DiAngelo's white fragility back before it was cool to dunk on her. So they're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to some audience questions. So just one last time, please hit like, please hit subscribe, and share the video with your friends. So take it away, Jen.
Thank you, Kale, and thank you, of course, to Jacobin for hosting this talk. So as Kale had mentioned, The Trouble with Diversity came out in 2006, and I think it's fair to say there was quite a bit of discussion around it at the time, and since then, Walter, you've given a number of talks. You've been published in Jacobin. So I kind of suspect that a fair amount of Jacobin's readers will already be familiar with kind of your central argument. But to just get everyone up to speed who might not be already familiar with your book, I'm going to read what I think is a kind of famously provocative quote from your introduction and ask you to explain it. So the quote from your introduction is, you write, "The commitment to diversity is at best a distraction and at worst an essentially reactionary position." So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I still think that's true. In fact, more than ever, I sort of think that's true. I mean, basically, the idea of the book was pretty straightforward. Was that, so this is like 2005, 2006. We'd actually been experiencing extreme rise in economic inequality in the US since the 70s, so for like a quarter of a century. But that had not really been on the forefront of the left, certainly not on the forefront of a kind of liberal set of problems. What in fact, so we had a kind of increasing gap between the rich and the poor, between the elite and the non-elite. But the way we had of dealing with that gap was not by trying to narrow it, but was by trying to diversify the elite. I mean, a perfect example would be, say, affirmative action for colleges. So you could worry that, oh my God, like all the kids at Harvard and Yale and Princeton are like white kids. And the way to solve that problem was to actually try and make sure that more of them were brown and black kids. Or you could worry that all the kids at Harvard and Yale and Princeton were rich kids. And the way to try and solve that problem is by getting more poor kids. A perfect version of this would be the whole discourse around, which continues really, around CEOs. So it was true then, and it's true now, that there are almost no female CEOs. And it was true then and true now, there are almost no black CEOs of major corporations. And it's true then and true now that CEOs make between 250 and 350 times more than, their lowest paid employee. So you sort of had a problem, and where you had a question. The question was, which is your idea of social justice? Is your idea of social justice that we should have like 50% women and 50% men making 350 times more than their average employee? Or is your idea of social justice that we should try to narrow the gap and worry less about, although not at all about, whether they were men or women, but we worry less about that and worry a lot more about what that gap meant and how to change it. So in my view, the correct answer was number 2. We should worry about like narrowing the gap. In the world's view, the correct answer turned out to be and still is number 1.
Mm-hmm.
So the general point of the book was that, if you thought of diversity as a way of addressing inequality, you were mistaken. Diversity actually was, right from the start, a way of managing inequality, of basically leaving things in terms of economic inequality more or less the same, but just trying to guarantee that, if we were in a university, more of the rich kids were black. If it was in a boardroom, more of the people in the boardroom were black and brown and women, etc. So what we left with was a steady state in terms of actual economic inequality, but a change in the skin colors of the people occupying the different rungs, the different deciles of American wealth.
Right.
Basically.
So I think, I think your book was in some ways a little bit ahead of its time, which means that it's still...
I think that's really wrong. My book has never had a time yet.
Well, what I mean to say is, I think that obviously like large parts of the argument that you just laid out are still incredibly relevant now. But at the same time, in the last 15 or so years, there have been sort of a few developments that have kind of changed how we talk about not just diversity, but also inequality and racism. So, for example, we weathered the Great Recession. And sort of out of that, we had things like Occupy Wall Street and, of course, the 2 Bernie Sanders campaigns. And, it's debatable whether those things succeeded, obviously. But I think one thing that they sort of changed was that they kind of made discussions of inequality like come to the fore a little bit more. But then also in that same time period, you've had sort of racial justice movements like Black Lives Matter. And then, of course, the election of Trump, which, a lot of people sort of interpreted as a white backlash or like a kind of ascent of like a new xenophobia or like a new wave of, anti-immigrant, racist sentiment. So in your view, like what has changed in the diversity discourse since your book coming out and now?
So the first thing I would say is not so much a change as an entrenchment. Actually, so Kale, do we have that like first slide? We have a few slides. We're making it enough like a lecture, so those of you who came for a lecture are going to feel like you've been to a lecture. And the first slide. So this is Silvercorp. For those of you who don't know, was the is kind of fascist U.S. company that was hired to participate in, organize the attempted right-wing coup in Venezuela a month or 2 ago. And the thing that really struck me, a friend sent me this, was that in the contract drawn up between the Silvercorp and the right-wingers in Venezuela, it had a diversity clause. So it strived to create a diverse project team, inclusive across gender, ethnicity, age. I mean, it's a kind of primitive one. It doesn't say anything about sexuality, it doesn't say anything about genetic testing and all that, but it's a diversity clause. You want to say, that's got to be the first coup, right? In first fascist coup in human history that actually has a diversity clause attached to it. I mean, I guarantee that like the Bag of Pigs, no one ever thought, well, we got to make sure that, we have the proper range of this. And then, if you think back, like, like the beer hall putsch, there's never a moment when like Hitler's walking in and he's talking to whatever it is, and the guy says, I don't know this. It looks a little Aryan in here, don't you think? Maybe we ought to like get a different kind of representation. That was the whole fucking point. It was supposed to look as Aryan as possible. They had a different view on diversity. So the one thing that I think, first of all, became entrenched and became almost thought of as kind of moderate thing was precisely this sense that diversity is so built into the DNA of corporate justice that you then need something stronger. You need to actually sort of double down on extra doses of anti-racism to actually make the diversity thing work. But truthfully, you've had, you came into the workforce, right around the time that The Trouble with Diversity was published. You probably have a much stronger sense on the ground. I'm old enough to, I go through diversity training, but it's like, it's modified. Whereas
right.
I'm curious to know what diversity training is for someone like you. When you started work, did you have to do it?
I have had to do it, and I think in most cases it's been kind of like the same thing that I think you've had to go through, which is a sort of like online, like perfunctory, like going through some slides and checking the right answers just to make sure you're sort of up to speed so that the company isn't liable or, isn't as vulnerable to discrimination lawsuits later down the line. But on the subject of, I guess, the diversity discourse kind of changing over time, around 10 years ago, I started working in book publishing. And I think, back then, the discourse around diversity was very much about diversity proper. So there was a campaign at the time called We Need Diverse Books, which was exactly what it sounded like. People really wanted to get diverse books and diverse authors and books about, people of color, more widely spread. And then, following from that, there was kind of this conversation like, well, to get more diverse books, we also have to have more diverse people in publishing, which back then, and I think to, a certain extent now, was predominantly white. So there was a lot of attention around that, getting more diverse books, getting diverse authors, diverse editors, diverse writers, just increasing diversity. And, there were a couple of sort of like watchdog organizations that would release every year, a kind of breakdown of the racial makeup at each of these, top publishing houses or whatever. And that would kind of start the conversation anew. But I think, over time, people sort of started to push back a little on just the straight up counting. I think, people started to kind of recognize that, like, for example, in publishing, it's predominantly women. Like, I think it's something like over 70% women, but at the same time, you still have a gender pay gap. So like, is that really, justice? I think what we started to see a lot more was that, a publishing house would look really diverse on paper. When these kind of like racial breakdowns came out, like it would show that, oh, there were a lot of people of color working at this publishing house. But then upon further inspection, it would sort of become clear that all of those people of color were working at lower levels or like maybe even like unpaid interns. And then the people at the top, the bosses, were still predominantly white. So I think, I think once that conversation kind of got underway, quite honestly, I almost feel like people don't talk about diversity as much anymore. Instead, they talk more about equity or inclusion, or in some cases even racial justice. And this is in white collar, like professional fields.
Right. So for sure, racial justice. I mean,
for sure.
Last 2 months, everybody's talked about racial justice.
Right. Exactly.
The question is how much of a difference that makes, right?
Right. Yeah. So fast forward a few years, I wasn't working in publishing anymore, but I started working and I worked very, very briefly at this place. It's a national level kind of like social justice NGO, and part of their mission is both economic and racial justice. They really saw themselves as doing what they called movement work. So as an employee there, everybody was kind of required to participate in this day-long training to talk about and sort of learn about what social justice movement work was. There was like a lot of radical language being used in this training. Like, people were not shy about talking about white supremacy, even capitalism. Before the training even started, we were all required to read articles about Freedom Summer and about the anti-apartheid South African movement. It seemed like a serious kind of effort at enacting some sort of racial justice, which as I say, was part of the organization's mission. But they also, were very vocal about wanting to like bring that to the workplace as well. But I guess I started to become a little suspicious when at one point during the training, we were all asked to break out into race caucuses, which is exactly what it sounds like, meaning there was a black caucus, a Latino caucus. There was a white caucus, which of course sounds like a neo-Nazi thing. So everybody had to keep ostentatiously calling it the anti-racist white caucus. I had to go to what was basically an other caucus, although they didn't call it that. I don't remember like what, like enlightened name they had for it, but it was basically like
traumatized by the experience to remember the actual name.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It was like, a group of like miscellaneous, and the interesting thing I remember is that, so we broke into these race caucuses and we were explicitly told, each caucus was explicitly told that we should not talk about what had happened in our caucus with members of other race caucuses. So, like that's all to say that basically at this, supposed social justice organization, we were literally divided by race and told not to talk to each other, which, like, to me, I guess it just seems sort of like doing capitalists' work for them.
Yeah, well, you put it very well. I mean, look, part of the problem with that's going to be that, and this obviously was part of the argument of the original book, but it's just become stronger. If you were going to write the book now and really wanted to disappear from sight instantaneously, you'd have called it not the trouble with diversity, but the trouble with anti-racism.
Right.
Because, I mean, part of the point of the argument is that actually anti-racism, while in a certain sense clearly essential, is also in another sense clearly being put, even by the people who are most sincerely committed to it, to ideological purposes which are really problematic. I mean, one way to see that, Kale, could you get that? So we were talking about what happened since 2005, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that's happened is we've had this rise of intensification of diversity discourse, intensification of anti-racism discourse, an increasing awareness. Each time is a new time that, no, it's a racist society, we got to do more about it. So if we look at the slide, just at what's happened economically, Kale, over the last, so that one, the share of wealth. So this is not broken out by race. We'll talk about race in a minute, right? This is just like the country as a whole. So an important thing to think, you can see 2005, that's about when the book comes out. That bottom line there, that's not like the bottom decile. That's like half the population of the US. So it's disproportionately black and brown, but it's totally minority white people. By far the most people there are white people. Their share of the wealth has gone down. It got bottomed out during the Great Recession. It's come back a little tiny bit. If you look about most of the rest of the population, that is the next 40%, that's the kind of gray kind of line, gray, brown, whatever it is. And they've gotten worse. They've also lost ground. So the only people who have gained ground, right? Well, basically the only people who really gained, the thing says, are the top 1%. So during this period, right, when now let's say the focus is increasingly on anti-racism, what has actually happened is that there's been a massive falling behind of the bottom 50% of the population, and a kind of less massive but very real falling behind of the next 40%. That is 90% of the people in the US, most of whom are white. Could we go to the other slide, the one that's got white wealth? So yeah, this is white people. So white people, if you look at one end of that slide, the 74.6% of white wealth is held by the top 10%. The way the people who put this material together, right, Matt Bruning says, is that basically almost all the wealth in the US is held by a bunch of white people. So the top 75% right there. If you look at it all the way down, you can see down to the bottom decile, again, this is all just white people. They've got negative wealth. Then you got 0.1%, 0.3%. Truth, so the bottom half basically has altogether something like about 2% of white wealth, 2.5% of white wealth. So what's the point of this slide? The point of this slide is that if you look at the distribution of wealth among white people, and you look at the distribution of wealth in the population as a whole, and you recognize the gap between the rich and the poor keeps getting much more intense, much worse. 2018 was the highest inequality yet. 2019 will probably be worse. 2020 will probably be a complete, total disaster for how that goes. If you look at that material, what you're seeing is that everybody is in fact suffering. And the account of why they're suffering that anti-racism gives us is that they're suffering because of racism. But a large majority of that people are actually not black and they're not brown. And if they're suffering, they're not suffering because of racism. If you were to say to all the people, the bottom 50%, those white people, so like, how is white supremacy, worked out for you guys? Isn't the fundamental problem here the disparity between black and white? They'd be kind of plausibly justified in saying, I'm just totally not experiencing the fundamental disparity between black and white. I'm totally getting a disparity thing, but it's not between black and white. And if you said to them, like a David Rediger kind of thing, well, yeah, but what about the wages of whiteness? What about the psychic wage you get from white supremacy? Screw David Rediger, absolutely get Du Bois himself to show up and explain to these poor white guys, well, it's true, you've got no money, but at least you've got the psychic benefits of white supremacy. If you're one of them, I'd rather say, fuck that, I'll take the money. And what you've got is a situation in which a problem that is endemic in the society as a whole and is a function of capitalism is being continually described as if the fundamental problem were racism, when in fact, everybody is experiencing, whether they're white or black. The economic inequality issue cannot be addressed by anti-racism. There's a guy, actually, let's do the other slide, the one from Robert Manduca. So this guy's work is being quoted everywhere these days, at least on a certain version of the left, and you can sort of see why. He did a really interesting study, and what he's shown is that, in fact, in the last half century, although, as we all know, basically African-American mean wealth is exactly where it was before in relation to white, no progress at all. In fact, African-Americans have been, as he says, advancing economically. The problem, the part we put in red, just as they were working their way up the income distribution, the distribution itself was collapsing down around them. What does that mean? That means the stuff we've been talking about, the rise of the 1%, to some extent the rise of the 10%. And if you're moving forward, sort of thinking about this in the future, today's high levels of income inequality further encumber the difficult struggle for racial economic equality. Because the income distribution has become so unequal, each hard-won increase in relative status, right, now translates into a smaller absolute rise in income. So you can keep on working anti-racism from here till hell freezes over. But as long as the people, in this case, the black and brown population, were disproportionately located in the bottom, deciles of the population right from the start, no amount of anti-racism can get them out of that. No amount of anti-racism can solve the problem of an economy which is becoming more unequal for everyone. So this kind of speaks to, an issue that everybody is aware of. Why corporations, why rich people are so down with anti-racism, and goes back to your question. Well, were they really sincere? Like, if you looked at publishing, yeah, all the minority people, all black and brown people were like unpaid interns, or maybe, genuinely making slave wages if they were making wages at all. So yeah, I have no doubt that many, if not most industries, have been too slow to adopt their own diversity discourse. But there's no reason for them not to. In other words, it does not harm those companies if they actually take this stuff seriously and make themselves into corporations where they really are 13.2% black in top management and 13.2% black all the way down. And the same thing for Asians, the same thing for whites, the same thing for Latinx people. Why does it harm them? Because it just redistributes the skin colors of the wealthy, and it redistributes the skin colors of the poor. So fine, you can do that, right? But you're, again, and this goes back to the very original point, you're not making the slightest difference in inequality itself. And under the current conditions, where black people are disproportionately toward the bottom, not because of current racism, although no doubt there is current racism for sure, we see it every day, but they're down at the bottom because they were there when this massive rise of inequality started, and anti-racism can't get them out of that. And when you put them in that situation, no amount of anti-racism will make a difference for poor black people. It'll make a difference for, and actually Manduca says, where there's been actual progress is in the creation, is in the top 10%. So actually we have I think we have a slide, another Brunig slide, that shows the distribution of wealth among the black population. So, as he points out, it just looks a lot the same. That is 10% of black people have basically almost all black wealth. And it's true for sure, right, that those 10% of black people don't have near as much wealth as the 10% of white people in that same graph for white guys, but it's the same structure of inequality. You're not going to solve that by anti-racism. Yeah.
So I do want to follow up on that by asking, in terms of strategy, like how we combat inequality. Something I've been thinking about is, over the last month, we've seen kind of an outpouring of protests against police violence, and protests against racism under kind of the overall umbrella of Black Lives Matter. And at least here in New York, protests have been going on nonstop for basically a month now. So this is something that I think the issue of racism and anti-racism still hold a lot of cachet, and people find them very powerful political projects. And we don't know what's going to come out of the protests yet. But there are some working class demands in there. I think that inequality is kind of one fact. Economic inequality is one factor of those protests. So my question for you is there a way to kind of bridge the two? Is there a way to use the language of anti-racism to make a case for left politics of economic equality?
Yeah. So, I guess what I want to say is no.
Go on.
Well, just because look, again, the anti-racism is crucial. No one who's seen what's happened, no one who's seen more of what's happened can have any sympathy with the people who've done this or deny the reality, which has been there for anybody who's lived in this country for a long time, that there actually is racism. So the point of this argument was never to deny there's racism.
Right.
The whole kind of class reductionist thing, whatever it is, does not involve denying there's racism. But the issue, and for sure, when you're trying to think about getting, it's well known, the police kill black people. They kill unarmed black people. It's actually also true. They kill a lot of unarmed white people. They actually kill more unarmed white people than black people. The disproportion becomes the issue. And disproportionality is real, but it's kind of like liberal math, and maybe we can talk about it. I don't think disproportionality matters in the same way that a lot of other people think it matters. But for sure, why doesn't it matter as much? Because it's not, for example, like it'd be okay if the cops proportionately killed black people. In other words, they didn't kill them for racist reasons. They just killed them the way they kill the white people too, presumably not for racist reasons, but just whatever kind of social control they need to do. So no one involved in the Black Lives Matter movement thinks that. But of course, you present this as the problem is killing black people because of racism, what you've done is already put something else on the back burner, which is no, the problem is killing people. The cops as a mode of social control of wealth in relation to poverty. The cops overwhelmingly kill poor people. The number, no one keeps data. I think, as far as I know, there have been some efforts to do this by tracking, deaths in zip codes, but they're not that effective. But I don't think anybody thinks that the cops kill lots of upper middle class black people. I don't think anyone thinks the cops kill any upper middle class white people, or it's a really bad day and something went super, super wrong. But they kill lots of poor people. And that is a fundamental function of this. Now, if we think the problem is the cops killing poor people, and we think of that problem as kind of emanating from the distribution of wealth in our society, and the necessity, the whole point of the police being, in a certain sense, to protect the wealth of the wealthy against the poor, then that's one way of thinking about this. And that raises the fundamental question of the distribution of wealth in American society. If you think the problem is the cops killing black people, then what you think is, no, the problem here is racism. And we have to sort of end the racist version of this. But we're not only not getting at the fundamental problem, we're in effect, in terms of our actions, suggesting that, if they do it out of racism, it's a problem. If they do it out of some other reason, that's like a secondary problem. But it's exactly the opposite. It's doing it as their fundamental part of their job, that's the problem. The fact that it's disproportionate with respect to black people is indeed the secondary part of the problem. So I think what you want, and that's true, of all the arguments that sort of hinge on disproportion. The very simplest and most straightforward one is that we absolutely know that black people are disproportionately poor, everything in the US. So 13.2% of the population, but about 25% down at the bottom. So how do we, and we know why. It's not like controversial. A couple hundred years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow. That's why.
Right.
And ongoing racism. Put all those things there. That's why. But the question you want to ask then is, okay, what is the problem?
Right.
Is the problem that racism has made them disproportionately poor? And if we got rid of racism, we got rid of all the marks of past racism, we got rid of current racism, we got rid of all that, then they would no longer be disproportionately poor, they'd be proportionally poor. There'd be 13.2%. And there'd be more white people down at the bottom.
Right.
And not the slightest thing in a left agenda that thinks that's a good result.
Right.
So,
so we actually just got a question, which I think, is related to this. And someone asked, well, what about the framework of racial capitalism? Because I think that, to a certain extent, like we're talking about economic inequality and how that kind of produces, racially disparate outcomes, and then anti-racism as sort of a separate thing. Is racial capitalism a good framework for understanding the kind of like marriage of the two?
Yeah, no, I think racial capitalism is a concept that's become increasingly popular because it's a way of people saying, okay, there's this argument made by people like me and Adolph Reed and Cedric Johnson saying anti-racism doesn't get the heart of capitalism. But if we kind of rebrand capitalism, we call it racial capitalism, then we can operate under the fantasy that anti-racism maybe will get at the heart of racial capitalism. I think that's a complete con. There's no question, right, that capitalism, for most of its history, has deployed and encouraged racism as part of its modes of production.
Right.
I say there's actually equally no question that today anti-racism is just as useful to capitalism as racism is. So you want to say that doesn't make anti-racism wrong. Obviously, anti-racism is right, but it makes anti-racism as such not a critique of capitalism. And that's part of what people, again, maybe I don't mean to sound cynical about this. I just, my experience over the years suggests it's sort of true. Part of what people like about it is that, anti-racism doesn't actually threaten certain kinds of basic arrangements of American society. That's the attraction of anti-racism. Think of it this way. Supposing people were out there saying, like, nationalize Amazon, nationalize the banks, nationalize Amazon. And their whole goal was socialism, the elimination of private property. We wanted to make all housing, for example, completely public. So go out and if we were doing that, would Amazon give millions of dollars to support the cause of like destroying Amazon? Obviously not. None of these corporations would do that. Interested, it's never they've never had a diversity program which involved like, so you all guys divided up. No one said, okay, and the socialists go over in that corner. Right? If you did go over in that corner, you would say, go over in that corner, and then don't come back.
Right.
Work for us if you're a socialist.
Yeah.
So there's a fundamental thing. And again, this is not, it goes back to what you were saying before. It's for sure true that there's lots of hypocrisy. And I'm sure there's lots and lots of racists involved with this. But what they're gradually discovering is that they don't need to worry about this. They could totally go for it. There's no reason why you can't go for the anti-racism, because anti-racism is attractive precisely insofar as it's not socialism. So what you want to say about that is that as long as we're doing this under the guise of anti-racism, and as long as the kind of class issues are the kind of added on ones that are, as it were, appendages to it, we've got it exactly backwards.
I do want to touch on the corporations issue for a second, because obviously with the ongoing protests against, police violence and racism, as you mentioned, corporations are sort of now falling over themselves to sort of, not just make statements, but actually, as you say, pour money and resources into, either donating money to anti-racist groups or, making commitments to diversify, their own ranks or whatever. And I think, as you were saying, like part of it is maybe sort of attributable, or like you could sort of say it's like cynicism or hypocrisy. But I also wonder, so I'm thinking about, I can't remember which company it is, but somebody basically put out a statistic recently that showed that they had given like $500,000 to Black Lives Matter, but like the year before they had spent $3 million on like trying to crush a union that their workers were trying to form.
Being right, but there's no contradiction between those two acts.
Well, right, yeah. I mean, well, so elaborate on that a little. Like, why is there no contradiction? Because the thing is, you could plausibly say, like, that's just PR, right? Like, they're kind of like flashing their racial justice bona fides on one hand, so they can secretly crush their union on the other.
Yeah. So the thing about it is, though, you could say that, but I just think that's wrong. You know, you can come out and say, look, we are completely anti-racist. And we're going to try and look at our boardroom, and we're going to try and look at our senior management, look at our middle management, and we're going to try and correct all the things that function in all those areas to keep Black and brown people out, or to make it so that Black and brown people are underpaid. So we're going to have them on the board. We're going to have them in senior management. We're going to have them in every meeting. They're going to be part of us. But that's totally different from like paying our workers more. We can't afford to pay our workers more. We're a capitalist business. We're trying to make money here. Jeff Bezos, I mean, you know, if Jeff Bezos became was a version of the jerk, and Jeff Bezos turned out to be a Black guy and could do like a Steve Martin thing, or Jeff Bezos actually just magically turned into a Black person. Kenneth Frazier, the guy who runs Merck, let it be that. So he becomes Amazon's run now by a Black CEO. And Amazon's management is Black all the way down. Let's just not even do diversity. It doesn't change management.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change the idea. I mean, the idea that the worker who works for Amazon for $15 an hour, let's say the Black worker working for Amazon for $15 an hour, is getting something out of upper management being like becoming Blacker and becoming browner is, I mean, that's the fantasy, of affirmative action.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, well, and you always think of it with colleges, it's like if you're going to college and someone says, yeah, it's true that almost no Black people can go to Harvard and Yale, but don't everybody feel kind of proud and feel represented when, there now are 18% Black people at Harvard? And you want to say, no one ever thought white people would think that. No one ever thought, oh, you're one of the poor white guys we talked about before, and someone says, yeah, it's true. You're kind of fucked, you got nothing. But think of all the white people at Harvard. Why is that good for you?
Right.
They are not your racial friends. They are your class enemy. It doesn't change when you go from white to Black.
Mm-hmm.
Frazier is not your racial friend. He's your class enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So when someone says, no, we genuinely need to diversify our management ranks, they don't need to worry about diversifying like the workers. The workers are already pretty diverse. Look at Amazon. They're not all white guys. They're all different kinds of people.
Right.
But the point of their business is to make money. So I don't think, I think the idea that this is kind of hypocrisy, or the idea that it's just a kind of cover, really doesn't get at the fundamental issue. They don't need to be pretending. Maybe they are pretending. Maybe they are secretly in their hearts racist, but they don't need to be racist. There's no contradiction between their anti-racism and their commitment to corporate profit, whereas there's a fundamental contradiction between socialism and their commitment to corporate profit. And that's the logic. It doesn't matter what their personal feelings are.
Right.
It's just built into the structure of the economy.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I also want to talk a little bit about how, socialists and communists in the US historically have had a lot of involvement in, organizing and fighting racial oppression. And I think actually a few of the Jacobin stay-at-home talks earlier this week were about that very thing. So again, this is to say that this is clearly, I think that this is like a very powerful kind of sentiment on the left that existed historically and now. And I think even, when you look at, again, with the protests against police brutality that are going on now, even if they're sort of framed as these racial justice protests or like these expressions of fighting for racial justice, there is also a class element. I mean, reforming the police, ending mass incarceration, those are policies that would obviously help the working class regardless of race. So what's the tension in looking at those as forms of anti-racism? Yeah,
so I mean, look, it's absolutely true that some of the demands would in fact have that effect, and that's good. I mean, I don't know of anybody on the left who opposes
Right.
the demand for racial justice, or who opposes the demand for defunding the police. Although the defunding the police thing is a kind of good example, because if you look at a city like Chicago, right, where there obviously have been and continue to be serious problems, and then you also look at like how many people were killed over the last week, and you see on the news people, in Englewood saying, catch these murderers, catch these murderers. You recognize that the policing function is kind of breaking down everywhere. Some people want more, some people want less. It completely doesn't work. So why doesn't it work? It's because, and if you take a few $1 million away from the police and put it into social work of various kinds, you're still talking about a very small amount of money. Why? Because in fact, the entire structure of the economy has pushed all this money into the top 1%, top 10%, and taken it out of not only people's hands, but out of the public. So in fact, the only way you could ever act, Chicago runs, the state of Illinois is like in extreme financial difficulty. Why? And we don't even have a graduated income tax, for Christ's sake. Passing the graduated income tax, which is not a demand that people are making on the street, would actually do more than defunding the police would do, because it actually give you money to begin to do some of these things. So part of the problem is at that level is that there's a certain kind of superficiality, but it's a superficiality that comes from, not really paying attention to the kind of political economy of the situation in the first place. The political economy of the situation in the first place is that with the current distribution of wealth, it does not matter all that much what you do with your city funds. It matters some, and it's an important kind of reform, and I completely support 95% of what I've heard, but it's not going to make a fundamental difference in any way, because the fundamental difference is made by the fact that, people talk about more for job training. For what jobs? For what job? When you get out of prison, right, and we end mass incarceration in a kind of fantasy world where we do it, and you go home and they're training you for jobs. What jobs are they training you for? The jobs that our economy produces are, as they're currently understood, low-wage jobs that don't require much education, and they're low-wage because they can keep people in and out. That's a problem that is not solved by defunding the police.
Right.
It's built into the structure of the economy. So it's like if you're doing all those things, it's not that they're not good. The trouble with diversity was not that diversity was bad.
Right.
Anti-racism was not that anti-racism is bad. The trouble with both those things is that as the center of your politics, they are basically just a left liberal politics. Edward Johnson said that Black Lives Matter, its current thing, was kind of militant liberalism. Why? Because they either don't deal at all or deal with as a kind of afterthought the sort of fundamental structure of the society.
So let's see. So a few more questions are coming in, and I like this one. So somebody asked, is a good takeaway for all of this, quote, don't just stop at racism, examine where racism came from and what it is defending. So I guess the question is since so many people find racism a compelling kind of framework for understanding, inequality in American life, can that be a starting point, or even a Trojan horse of sorts to talk about inequality?
I like the Trojan horse idea. But sure, anything can be a starting point. The only reason I'm kind of reluctant to sort of be nicer about this is that ever since I wrote The Trouble with Diversity, and ever since I started talking about this, so I get lots of lectures to talk to people. It's fun to do. It's interesting. Everybody always says some version of that. Even 15 years ago, people were saying some version. Well, okay, but it isn't going about racial difference and thinking about racism a way into these bigger problems. So I want to say two things. The first is that experience suggests no. All the time people have been talking about using racism as a wedge into the more fundamental problems. If there are more fundamental problems, nobody's interested in doing that. And as I said before, corporations are not giving billions of dollars to help us produce socialism.
Right.
So, but if you want to kind of go back and say, okay, but no, what about people who start thinking about racism? And after they start thinking about racism, start thinking, well, you have to understand what the political economy of racism is, and then understand what the political economy of anti-racism is. That is what it means that elite institutions, can be. So we have one more slide, right? We got our little non-site university slide.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you put that one up there. So I was giving a talk a couple of years ago. This is This is a picture taken, I think, at UC Riverside. It's taken by actually a really great photographer. This is not representative of his work. He was just in the audience. I call it Amir Zaki. His work is really interesting. And the talk was about just in the last 6 months before I was giving it, I was talking about where there had been sort of important outbreaks of anti-racism on university campuses, all of which I approve. Like, I have zero problem with the kids at Middlebury acting up and getting a little bit violent with Murray. That's not my issue. But what one was struck by, right, was that all these places were basically places where there were, rich kids. I mean, these are median student family incomes at these universities. So when you look at that and say, okay, all these guys are worked up about anti-racism, and they're tearing down monuments, they're changing the names, and they're heckling sort of racist visitors, I don't have a problem with that. All those things are fine. Mm-hmm. Do they show anything like the anxiety, right, about their own class status? They are very worried about white privilege.
Right.
They don't want to exercise white privilege, but they don't want to exercise white privilege at Middlebury. They don't want to exercise it at Yale. They don't want to exercise it at Oberlin. They want to get the class privilege that puts you there in the first place, but then you absolutely develop a racial etiquette. So whatever you do, you're not treading on the toes of any black people. That's, bullshit. I mean, that's just complete. It's not even hypocrisy. It's not hypocrisy because there is no contradiction between the two. You can be totally in favor of class inequality, but want to have it more fairly distributed by race. But it is, from the standpoint of the left politics, their anti-racism is not turning into a kind of what do we do about the fundamental class structure? In fact, this is an empirical question. I haven't got lots of evidence except what actually happens. Where do those people go on to jobs? At Goldman Sachs, which is great for diversity, and all those places like that. It actually is an alibi for one's complete acquiescence in the class structure. Mm-hmm. So if anti-racism serves as an alibi, that's not so useful. And then part of the way in which it becomes a kind of morality instead of a politics. So everybody loves to call out people who are racist, and you can call out people who are racist at the highest levels of American society. And the point about that is it's morality. Is it wrong? No, it's not wrong. Actually, there's some way in which it is importantly true that racism is immoral. But morality, it's not a politics, or if it is a politics, it's the morality of a liberal politics. So deeply inscribed in liberalism that instead of being a way into a kind of more fundamental way of thinking about it in terms of the structure of class, it's a way of avoiding more fundamental structures of class.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, so I would like to sort of drill down a little more into the relationship between racism and capitalism. Those seem to be the kind of bulk of the questions that are coming in. So one person writes, W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of the centrality of the fight against racism. Are capitalism and racism not inextricably linked and not hierarchicized? So I guess that's a way of asking I think the way that most people on the left understand it, racism has been sort of historically used to divide the working class. And perhaps, I think that to a large extent that may still be going on today. So how then do we, both kind of synthesize what you've been talking about and also effectively fight racism in order to build a stronger class politics?
So, there was always there's been a debate sort of on the left for a long time about whether, capitalism and racism, whether racism is intrinsic to capitalism.
Right.
The way somebody, Ellen Maxson Woods, put it years ago was that you can have capitalism without racism. So I've always thought that was a kind of empty position. I mean, she was a great person in many ways. It's kind of empty position. It was clear that we hadn't had capitalism without racism. So while it might be theoretically possible to have capitalism without racism, we hadn't had capitalism without racism. But of course, it also doesn't mean that to have capitalism, you have to have racism. One of the things as I'm saying, this was part of the great lack of success of a certain kind of the trouble with diversity. Part of the point of the trouble with diversity was, although I didn't quite see to put it this way, which is that, capitalism has been crucial. And racism has been crucial for capitalism, dividing the working class. But actually, it turns out that anti-racism also can play a crucial role in support of capitalism, and a crucial role in dividing the working class.
Right.
So, for example, I mean, like every Karen who gets called out on the internet now, right? I mean, these are people who tend to be, they don't look like rich people to me, and their racism is appalling. And what do we get out of that? We get this incredible sense of moral superiority, and people like us, or withdraw us. Let's say people who belong to a certain social class, either in virtue of their education or in virtue of their jobs or in virtue of, and this probably would eliminate both of us, their inherited wealth, can look at these people and say, not only are these people, these people are not only are they immoral, they're both poor and immoral. So what you get is a kind of condescension to and moral disapproval of like some fantasy of the white working class. So part of the idea there is that if you want to build a politics around class, it's not that we should ignore the racism, we should do everything against the racism, but you want to recognize that, you go back to like a black CEO like Fraser, that guy does more damage to every black person every day in virtue of the way that corporation does its business in terms of how they pay people than all the Karens do, at every moment. That's the enemy. They're the class enemy. So I do think it's true, right, that people love the idea and are deeply attached to the idea that because racism and capitalism in an important way grew up together, this is the racial capitalism fantasy, that therefore fighting racism is a way of fighting capitalism. But that's just like, in our moment, almost self-evidently not true. And again, the purest form of it is that corporations love the fight against racism. So you would say today is that, yeah, it's important to keep the fight against racism going, but it's actually important to disarticulate it from the fight against capitalism and see that they may involve the same actions, right? And may overlap, and for sure would overlap. There could not be any justice if we somehow got socialism but maintained like the racism. Although it's worth pointing out that if you actually had socialism, a lot of the negative effects, all the ones about the unequal distribution of wealth, which are at the core, Ta-Nehisi Coates said at some point, you can see exactly how much, this is not an exact quote, but I think it gets at the idea, how much white people don't care about black people, right? If you look at the racial disparity in wealth. But you want to look at that again and say, look at the bottom 50% of all those white people. You can see also how much a whole bunch of white people don't care about other white people. If you had socialism, that whole don't care about, the rich don't care about the poor, would disappear. So it's a kind of, a way of putting it would be, it's an asymmetrical relation. That is, the asymmetry is anti-racism doesn't in itself bring you much in the way of anti-capitalism. Anti-capitalism actually does bring you quite a bit in the way of anti-racism.
Right, yeah.
Asymmetry is crucial. And that's why, like the whole class reductionist thing, fantasy about this, the fantasy is that class reductionists, whoever they are, don't care about race. Like, I don't know that anybody meets that description. But the truth of it is, and this is part of, I take to be, a left analysis, is that there's an important sense in which class is primary. And that sense helps explain why racism can work for capitalism. It helps explain why anti-racism can also work for capitalism. And it also helps explain why neither one of them, or why anti-racism cannot do what we want it to do unless it is inscribed in a kind of class analysis.
Yeah. So that gets me to, the question of, as you say in The Trouble with Diversity, you're not opposed to diversity. You say, of course, we should be opposing and fighting racism at the same time. So what is an effective left way of doing that? That doesn't kind of open up a space for the, corporate or liberal hijacking of that kind of anti-racist politics.
Yeah. So first of all, that's a hard question.
Yeah.
In other words, and that a lot of that is a question about organizing people sort of where they are, like in their workplace. So that's why people on the sort of who are interested in those issues think about workplaces a lot, think about unions a lot, think about how to do that. That's why the controversy over police unions is so fundamental right now. Because we like unions. On the other hand, we don't for sure love the police union. And how do we think about, what the relation between those two things is? But I don't, in Yeah, I don't actually have a kind of good answer to that question. I mean, the difference you want to say about this is if you'd had like, well, you could think of it in terms of the Sanders campaign.
Hmm.
I mean, if you
Yeah.
take the ill-disguised delight, right, with which people like Kimberly Crenshaw in the Times or other writers in the Nation and elsewhere are proclaiming that the problem with the Sanders campaign was now been really proven. It wasn't strong enough on race. It just kept on being too much on these economic issues.
Hmm.
I think that's just like a pure moment in which you see what is the truth of most anti-racism now, which is above all, it has nothing whatsoever to do with anti-capitalism. And instead, and that the Sanders, which is social democratic and by any standard not a radical movement at all, and I, supported Sanders, but I'm not like a true Jacobin diehard. I kept my tears to a minimum when the whole thing collapsed, so I'm not, like, it's not for me about Sanders, but it's about the sort of depressing fact that the Sanders emphasis on the class question and on universal, the healthcare issues, the housing issues, the education issues, all those things, that really was a step in the right direction.
Hmm.
Kind of revanchism against that, the sort of sense that now this is the true movement, is more or less greeted with delight by every corporation in the country who, as unthreatening as Bernie Sanders is, we're more worried about Bernie Sanders than they are about 16 million people marching in the streets against racism.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so is that a prescription for how to go forward? No, because the Sanders campaign crashed and burned. So it's not a prescription for how to go forward. And this is where I fall back on, hey, like I'm an English professor, I got nothing on how to go forward that Sanders didn't have. But I think it is a kind of useful warning, which is that, as I say, the kind of ill-disguised glee is glee precisely at the idea that these fundamental issues can be left completely untouched.
Right. So that reminds me that I also wanted to ask you about a line that both you and Adolph Reed have kind of been using for quite some time. And you guys say that I think you say something like anti-racism is not an alternative to class politics. It's a form of class politics. And since you bring up Bernie, like when both of his campaigns were going on, obviously there was all of this rhetoric about, like, as you said, how bad on race he was and how he couldn't talk about race. And, like he was just a class only type and just didn't have the language of race. And for both campaigns, I was always like so shocked in a way by that language because, as you mentioned, like, every one of his policies would have done more to help, poor Black and brown people than, I don't know, some sort of like vague commission in the Senate on reparations and what that means, right? But it occurred to me at some point that the reason why all of these, journalists and like kind of, media and political class types were hammering Bernie on race. I mean, I'm sure a lot of it was cynical just because they hated him and like wanted to get him out. But I think part of it is just that he didn't talk about race in the sort of accepted professional managerial class register, like.
He didn't talk about race. Like, the fundamental problem was how to get more Black people into the upper middle class.
Right, exactly. Or he didn't use like a lot of the kind of pseudo-academic language or the pseudo-academic and activist language that has sort of like come into mainstream discourse. Like, he didn't really talk about like intersectionality, or like settler colonialism.
When people talk about intersectionality, that's another version of total diversity would be the trouble with intersectionality. It's mainly kind of like a moment when you think, oh my God, this analysis might lead to actual redistribution of wealth. Let's make it a little more intersectional so there's no possibility of any actual redistribution of wealth.
Right.
The point would be, but I think going back to what you said before, is the answer is, I mean, you really put it better than I could, is it's not just that he doesn't have the right language. I mean, after all, he's always even older than I am, and I've been a professor. I know what everybody says in the academic world because I hear it every day. So he doesn't know that. But I think it was more than that. I think that what everybody's saying in the academic world, the language he doesn't know, the language of intersectionality, really is the language of how we do diversity now. It really is the outrage that there aren't enough people of color in the upper middle class, that there's a kind of that racism is ongoing, and that the thing which is for sure true, but that the problem with the racism that's ongoing is that it leads to disproportionality. Too many poor black people, insufficiently, an insufficient number of rich black people. So Bernie was seriously not interested in doing that. He had, the core of the Sanders campaign, he was not interested in legitimating the class structure by making sure that every race was appropriately represented. It was interested in a, albeit reformist and whatever, by no means revolutionary way, but it was actually interested in challenging the class structure and in some sense at least beginning to minimize the differences between classes. So even that has been proven to be unacceptable. And it's proven to be unacceptable to two groups. One group that we know is like all those corporations totally did not want Bernie, right? And the other group is all those people now who are explaining how what's going on in Black Lives Matter show that Bernie really wasn't serious. No, the real working class is on the streets now. And the corporations love them because the corporations understand extremely quickly that in fact, once you take a class, analysis out of the picture, then what have you got? There's a whole bunch of people who are opting for morality, which is right. You can absolutely stand up for it and not feel that you're betraying anything. You can feel you're doing the right thing. And it also represents no danger whatsoever to the class structure which has produced your success. And again, just want to remember, we don't live like in an ordinary time. 1968 was the most economically equal moment in American history. Or this week, actually, at least since we started measuring these things. Every year since 1968 has gotten more unequal. The outstanding fact about our moment right now is that we are the most unequal we've ever been. So when you're the most unequal you've ever been, when that inequality affects every race, if you look at people making under $10,000 a year, 56% of them are white. If you look at people making like under 35, between 30 and 35, 67% of them are white. So we're saying and we've convinced them, Trump actually is really good at this. We've convinced them that they're the victims of racism too. Barbara and Karen Fields make this point in Racecraft, and they made it theoretically, and then all these polls show it's true. The theoretical point was that if you take exploitation off the table, which is the fundamental mechanism of a class society, and you replace it by, in effect, by anti-racism, then the only way people have of understanding their grievances is anti-racism. And then what you got is, you got white people who are so not the victims of racism. But if you look at any one of the studies people have done the last 4 or 5 years, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, white people increasingly think they, in fact, are the victims of racism. And Trump supporters are totally convinced that the world is out to get white people. This is completely wrong, but it's a complete function of a world in which the only way we have of actually understanding inequality is, in effect, the neoliberal theory of inequality, which is that they're bad inequalities, and those are the ones that come from racism or sexism, and they're good ones. Those are the ones that come from inefficiency. So if the left accepts that, the left is no longer the left. And I think the great thing about Bernie was he just didn't accept that.
Right, yeah.
And that's why people hated him.
Right, yeah. So we are running up against our time limit now, but I got one last question in, and I think it's really interesting. So I'm going to ask this to you, and I think we can end on this note. So somebody asks, let me find it. So somebody wants to know, how did we so seamlessly move from this idea that biological racism is bad to cultural heritage is good? How do the race reductionists manage this sleight of hand?
Yes, okay. That's a kind of a ringer question. So Trouble with Diversity does have a really good account of how that works.
Yeah.
So I recommend to that person to read The Trouble with Diversity. You can probably find it all online at this point. You don't even have to buy it, although I apologize to my publisher for saying that. But the kind of core thing is that, I wrote a previous book, which is an academic book called Our America, and it's about sort of race. Actually, it was about racism in American literature. But part of the point of it is that you had the kind of high point of biological racism in the 1920s. But it was accompanied by a kind of left critique, which was that it was a mistake to think of race as biological, and we should think instead of cultures. And George Boas and anthropology was at the heart of this, but there are many forms of that critique. So it was the movement from race as biology to no, it's a kind of cultural thing. But what we immediately did, and actually this is what led me to write The Trouble with Diversity in the first place, I was really struck by the fact that when people started thinking there were no such things as races, as biological races, instead of like saying, when people discovered there were no such things as unicorns, no one ever said, well, what about like the social construction of the unicorn? Or what about like unicorn culture? It's true, it's like a biological thing. I mean, you can be unicorn without having like the unicorn, but still, it's a kind of cultural thing. No one thought that, right? So people immediately moved to new ways of inventing race, and ways which are actually theoretically incoherent. Like, if you're raised as a Black person, and you are biologically, although that means nothing, right? A Black person, no one thinks. People say it means nothing. It's not as if you have any culture other than the way you're raised. If you're raised to listen to nothing but Beethoven and never listen to, sticking with Chicago, Chief Keef, and then someone says, well, but when he gave up Beethoven and started paying attention to Chief Keef, he's going back to his culture. What made that your culture? Your culture, the whole point of culture had nothing to do with your biology, right? I mean, the whole point of the model, you can see how committed we've been to this in race all the way through. Even if you think of biological things, we have the category of mixed race, and there's a kind of increasing, like, people are arguing for putting mixed race on the census doing this. But if you have, like, if you're the child of a tall mother and a short father, no one says, well, like, you're a person of mixed height. If you're a child of a smart mother and a stupid father, no one says you're a person of mixed intelligence. Race has always been essentialized. And when we stopped essentializing it biologically, we started essentializing it culturally. And there's a reason for that. It's because race, and this is where I would say, this goes back to, we could stop with this, the question of racism and anti-racism and capitalism. I think capitalism can probably live without racism and live with just anti-racism now. I think there's obviously a long time capitalism couldn't live, didn't need anti-racism and just cared about, racism. But capitalism really needs race. Why? Because race divides people in ways that have nothing to do with their class.
Mm-hmm.
And that's super functional in a capitalist society. It's not like a conspiracy thing. It's not like someone thought it up, but it's super functional because it precisely gives you a sense of who you are, your identity, which has nothing to do with your class position. So there's a way in which there's a much more technical account of this, The Trouble with Diversity, and a more technical account still if you're really a masochist in our America. But the core of it is that capitalism loves racial identity.
I think that is actually a perfect note to end on. And to everyone out there, if you haven't yet picked up The Trouble with Diversity, you should definitely do that. So thank you, Walter, and thank you to Jacobin and Kale and Bhaskar for putting this on. And thank you all to watching.
Yeah, so have a good July 4th, whatever that might mean. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.